The conclusion of World War II marked an end to a unique period of global military tension. For many nations, the cessation of active hostilities brought about not a moment of relief, but a wave of new and unprecedented challenges. One of the most immediate concerns for the Allied and Axis powers alike was the fate of the military assets they had spent the war amassing. Coastal defense guns, massive, stationary artillery pieces built to guard shores against potential naval invasions, were among the most conspicuous remnants of wartime planning. These guns, some towering in size, had been constructed to repel any assault from the sea, a threat that, after 1945, no longer existed for most nations. Their fate was as varied as the nations that had deployed them, but all were faced with the same question: what to do with such enormous, obsolete armaments when the primary reason for their existence vanished with the end of war? Across the continents, the aftermath of World War II created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Entire industries, previously focused on war production, now faced the daunting task of conversion or shutdown. Tens of thousands of soldiers, once stationed to operate the guns, were being demobilized and returned to civilian life, leaving coastal defenses abandoned in their wake. The world, now exhausted by years of conflict, had neither the resources nor the will to maintain vast, outdated arsenals. In Europe, especially in the former Axis and Allied occupied territories, coastal defenses were considered as both symbols of past aggression and logistical burdens. And for the victorious Allies, the focus shifted quickly to rebuilding and securing the future, rather than preserving wartime relics. The situation was not unique to any single nation. From the shores of Norway, where Germany had constructed formidable artillery positions to guard against British and Soviet invasions, to the coasts of France and the British Isles, the guns stood in varying states of disrepair. Many of the large coastal defense guns were simply too costly to maintain. Even in the United States, where the threat of invasion had never materialized, a large number of coastal artillery installations which had been built for fear of a Japanese assault were now obsolete. The question of what to do with these guns was compounded by a complex mixture of economic pressure, political considerations, and military pragmatism. By 1946, many coastal defenses were either dismantled or decommissioned, but the exact fate of each varied widely depending on the nation involved. In Germany, the situation was particularly dire. The Third Reich had constructed some of the largest coastal defenses in history, including the massive 28 cm SKL/50 guns, designed for coastal and anti-shipping purposes. These were among the most sophisticated artillery pieces ever built, capable of launching shells over 30 kilometers. But after the war, Germany's defeat brought about both physical and ideological dismantling. The guns had been rendered surplus by the Allied occupation of Europe. The sheer scale of the destruction and the limits on military production imposed by the Allies made it impossible for Germany to continue any form of coastal defense. A large number of these coastal guns were either scrapped or buried in the aftermath, and in some instances, they were simply left in place, abandoned on the shores they had once protected. A few survived, and some were repurposed by the occupying powers, but the majority disappeared into scrap yards or were otherwise lost to history. In the United Kingdom, the guns had been critical in the early years of the war, defending against a possible invasion by Nazi Germany. By 1945, however, the threat of invasion had passed, and many of the coastal defense batteries were quickly abandoned. Britain had constructed a vast network of coastal artillery, including 15-inch guns on platforms such as the coastal defense batteries at Dover and other strategic locations. These immense weapons, once a central part of Britain's defensive posture, were quickly deemed unnecessary after the end of the war. The government, facing an economy in ruins and a populace eager for peace, found little utility in maintaining vast stockpiles of obsolete artillery. Most were sold off, repurposed, or scrapped. Some guns, however, were kept for use in training or for potential future emergencies, though these uses were rare. In France, coastal defenses were a direct result of the German occupation and the subsequent use of the Atlantic Wall, a series of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. The German coastal defense guns were some of the most formidable ever constructed, with several coastal batteries featuring massive naval guns originally intended for battleships. These installations, such as the famous Battery Tote in northern France, were equipped with 380mm guns capable of shelling targets dozens of miles out to sea. After the liberation of France in 1944, the German occupation infrastructure, including the coastal defense guns, was either dismantled or used by the French government. However, the immense size and weight of many of these weapons made removal and transport logistically impractical. In many cases, the guns were abandoned, left rusting in place, or buried by the retreating German forces. Despite attempts by the French military to salvage and repurpose some of the guns, many were simply scrapped or left to deteriorate. Beyond Europe, the fate of coastal guns in the Pacific was also shaped by a dramatically different set of circumstances. For the United States, the primary concern after the war was the transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime one. While Japan had been defeated, American coastal defenses, many constructed for the anticipated invasion of Japan, were now irrelevant. The U.S. had an enormous arsenal of coastal artillery, much of it concentrated on the Pacific Islands and along the west coast. Some of these guns were sold to foreign governments, while others were repurposed for military installations that continued to operate in the post-war era. Yet, the vast majority were rendered obsolete. The economic pressure to demobilize and convert military spending to more pressing national priorities, such as rebuilding Europe under the Marshall Plan and addressing the early Cold War threats, meant that maintaining these expensive coastal defense systems was no longer feasible. As the 1940s drew to a close, the fate of coastal defense guns was tied to the rapidly changing geopolitical realities of the post-war world. The United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom were now focused on global influence, preparing for the next phase of military and political competition, the Cold War. In this new context, the heavy, stationary guns that had once been essential to national defense were increasingly seen as burdens. Nations were grappling with the economic costs of maintaining wartime military infrastructure, with many looking to free up resources for more strategic uses. In Scandinavia, nations like Norway and Denmark, which had relied heavily on coastal artillery to protect their shores, also faced the dilemma of what to do with surplus weaponry. Norway, occupied by Germany during the war, had inherited a complex legacy of coastal defense installations. After the war, these were either dismantled or scrapped, but some installations were kept in service for defensive purposes against the still uncertain Soviet threat. Denmark, with its strategic position in the Baltic Sea, also faced similar challenges, though its limited resources and proximity to the growing tensions of the Cold War meant that many of its coastal defense systems were quickly phased out. As the post-war years unfolded, the fate of the coastal defense guns became symbolic of a larger shift in military strategy and geopolitics. What had once been a critical part of national security became, almost overnight, a symbol of obsolescence and excess. By the early 1950s, many of the world's coastal guns had been either scrapped, buried, or left to rust in place. The economic pressure on nations to prioritize modern military technologies, combined with the shift toward air power and nuclear deterrence, rendered the vast majority of these coastal defenses obsolete. Their fate, then, was not one of sudden destruction but of gradual decay, an inevitable consequence of a rapidly changing world order. The transition from a post-war economy to one focused on rebuilding, modernization, and the dawn of the Cold War sealed the fate of many coastal defense guns. The strategic importance of these massive artillery pieces quickly diminished, yet their physical presence persisted, sometimes as eerie remnants of a bygone era. As the 1950s unfolded, nations began to grapple not only with the question of what to do with surplus military assets but also with the broader geopolitical shifts that would render these vast, stationary weapons all but irrelevant. In the United States, the end of World War II had triggered an economic transformation. Military expenditures, which had once been essential to victory, now had to be re-evaluated. The rapid demobilization of forces meant that coastal defenses, once seen as crucial, were simply not a priority in an increasingly complex world. The Cold War presented a new threat, one defined by the nuclear arms race and the dominance of air power. As a result, the the massive coastal defense guns scattered across American coastal fortifications, from the East Coast to the Pacific, were gradually phased out. Many of the larger, heavier pieces were sold for scrap or abandoned in place, left to deteriorate with time. The U.S. Army, which had initially operated these massive guns, turned its attention to more mobile and modern artillery systems. The need for fixed coastal defenses was recognized as increasingly obsolete, and funds were instead redirected to developing air superiority and more flexible, rapid-response military structures. On the Pacific Islands where the U.S. had once feared a Japanese invasion, the coastal guns that had guarded the beaches were no longer necessary. In the case of some island installations, like those in Hawaii and Guam, local authorities or military planners chose to preserve certain installations as historical markers or military training sites. However, the fate of the majority was less ceremonious: scrapped, buried, or left to rust in the salty air. In Western Europe, the need to reassess the status of coastal defense guns was acutely felt in countries like France and the United Kingdom. The once feared German coastal batteries, including the famous Atlantic Wall installations, were among the most potent coastal defenses in history. Yet, after the Allied victory, the occupying forces were left with the challenge of managing these vast systems of armaments. In France, the Germans had constructed hundreds of batteries, many of which included massive naval guns originally meant for battleships. When the war ended, France inherited much of this artillery. However, most of the remaining German installations were considered impractical and outdated. Some of the guns were repurposed by the French military. A few found new life in defensive capacities along the French coast, primarily for training purposes, but the expense and maintenance required to keep these guns operational quickly proved too great. As the Cold War took hold, France, like other Western European nations, turned to more modern methods of defense. Air power, surveillance technologies, and nuclear deterrence became the cornerstones of military strategy. Maintaining massive coastal artillery batteries seemed a waste of resources in a world where a new and more lethal form of conflict was emerging. Much like in Britain, large numbers of these guns were simply scrapped or abandoned in place, though a few were preserved as historical sites. The story of the Atlantic Wall's coastal defenses is perhaps best exemplified by the famous Battery Todt, located in northern France near the town of Ottingen. The installation, equipped with 380mm guns, was part of the German effort to prevent any Allied amphibious landings. After the war, it was briefly used by the French military, but soon it became clear that the enormous costs of maintaining the gun emplacements were unjustifiable. The guns were dismantled, the site abandoned, and the remaining structures decayed over time. Today, Battery Todt stands as a silent reminder of the transient nature of military power, a defunct relic from a war that had reshaped Europe. While much of Western Europe sought to dismantle or repurpose its coastal defenses, the post-war fate of coastal guns in the Soviet Union followed a different trajectory. For the USSR, the immediate post-war years were defined by their need to fortify borders and expand spheres of influence. In countries such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former German coastal defense installations were integrated into the Soviet defensive system. Many of the massive artillery pieces were kept in place or converted to serve as secondary artillery batteries. The strategic importance of these weapons lay not in their ability to repel an invasion from the sea, but in their ability to reinforce Soviet control over newly acquired territories. The Soviet Union, with its centralized economy and extensive military apparatus, was less prone to the economic pressures that plagued Western Europe and the United States. The Soviet military maintained a doctrine that valued large-scale defense structures, including coastal artillery. These guns, however, were not as numerous or as well-maintained as their Western counterparts. Over time, however, even the Soviet Union began to question the value of such large stationary weapons, especially as the advent of long-range missiles and air superiority increasingly overshadowed the need for heavy coastal artillery. In the 1960s, many Soviet coastal defense guns were eventually scrapped or left abandoned, their strategic significance lost in the shifting tides of military technology. By the time the Cold War had entered its second decade, the decline of coastal defense artillery was complete. Advances in air power, missile technology, and nuclear deterrence rendered these guns irrelevant. Coastal fortifications, once crucial to the defense of nations, had become little more than symbols of an older military doctrine. The fate of the guns, once symbols of national pride and formidable defenses, was largely sealed. They were scrapped, abandoned, or repurposed for less intensive uses. Yet, some of these coastal defenses would survive in unexpected ways. A few, scattered across the world, were preserved as historical monuments. These installations now serve as poignant reminders of a period in history when the world was divided by oceans, and nations turned to massive, immovable structures to safeguard their borders. On the coastlines of Normandy, the British Isles, and the Pacific Islands, rusting artillery pieces remain, slowly eroding with the passage of time, their once proud positions now encroached upon by nature. A handful of surviving guns have been kept as tourist attractions, their imposing size drawing curious visitors to sites of historical significance. They stand, silent and still, reminders of a world that no longer exists. The final fate of most coastal defense guns, however, was far less romantic. Scrapping these massive pieces of artillery was often a costly and labor-intensive process. The enormous weight of many of the guns made transport difficult, and the necessary infrastructure to remove them was often non-existent in post-war Europe and the Pacific. Where scrapping was not feasible, some guns were simply abandoned, left to rust on forgotten beaches or in overgrown coastal bunkers. The few that were repurposed often found themselves relegated to auxiliary uses, either as training tools for new military recruits or as stationary targets for missile practice. Yet even these roles were temporary. As modern military technology advanced, the need for such antiquated weapons diminished, and even their secondary functions were eventually abandoned.